And then I said, wait a minute, these people are all paying for a ticket. They've all come to see you.
When people think of Paul McCartney, they picture the cheerful smile, the endless melodies, and the man who helped define modern music. To the world, he is a symbol of love, peace, and optimism. But behind the public image lies someone far more complex. Paul is ambitious, sensitive, and deeply protective of his art. Though he rarely admits it out loud, he has carried a mental blacklist of those who hurt him, betrayed him, or crossed lines he could never forgive. Join us as we unveil the names of the people Paul McCartney confessed he truly hated and the stories behind those broken bonds. The roots of a fighter. To understand Paul's grudges, you first have to understand Paul himself. He was born in 1942 in Liverpool into a humble working-class family. His childhood was filled with music. Paul's father played piano, and songs floated naturally through their home. But when he was just 14, tragedy struck. His mother, Mary, died of breast cancer. That loss shaped him forever. Music became his escape, his comfort, his way of surviving grief. And it was in this fragile state in 1957 that fate brought him face to face with another Liverpool teenager, John Lennon. Together, they would form one of the most powerful creative partnerships in history. But as much as their bond brought the world joy, it also carried the seeds of rivalry and anger. John Lennon was the first name on Paul McCartney's blacklist, but he wouldn't be the last.
I don't think it's quite 100. That's what we used to tell people, but we exaggerated a bit. But there's quite a few songs that we wrote before we got one published.
John Lennon, brother, rival, enemy. When Paul McCartney met John Lennon in 1957, it was like two sparks colliding. Paul was only 15, John was a little older, and both of them carried the same hunger, which was to make music, to escape the gray streets of Liverpool, and to leave their mark on the world. Together, they built the Lennon-McCartney partnership, a force that gave birth to songs people still sing today. Yesterday, Let It Be, A Hard Day's Night, and countless more. For years, they were inseparable. They laughed together, wrote together, and leaned on each other through fame that neither could have handled alone. But behind the smiles, cracks were already forming. Paul was a perfectionist. In the studio, he would insist on retakes, polishing every detail until the song matched the sound in his head. John admired Paul's talent, but often bristled at his control. By the late 1960s, what had once been a brotherhood was turning into a tug-of-war. The death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967 deepened the divide. Paul wanted to keep the Beatles working, to channel their grief into music. John, restless and disillusioned, began pulling away. He found comfort in Yoko Ono, and with her came a new world of art, politics, and rebellion. Paul, meanwhile, tried to hold the band together, but his leadership only made John feel smothered. The breakup of the Beatles in 1970 turned tension into open warfare. In interviews, John spoke coldly about Paul's music, calling it shallow. And in 1971, he poured all his resentment into a song, How Do You Sleep? The lyrics cut like a knife, mocking Paul's songs, mocking his image, mocking the man himself. It was a very public declaration of hatred. Paul, hurt but unwilling to show it, fought back in his own way. His solo track, Too Many People, contained sly digs at John and Yoko. It wasn't as direct as John's attack, but the message was clear. The wounds ran deep. For years, the two men traded barbs through music and the press. But underneath all the rivalry and resentment, there was still love. Paul once admitted that even when they were enemies, he still admired John's brilliance. And John, in quieter moments, admitted the same about Paul. Tragically, they never had the chance to fully reconcile. On the night of December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his home in New York. When Paul heard the news, he was stunned into silence. To reporters, he muttered, "It's a drag," a comment that made him seem cold. But inside, he was devastated. He later confessed that he could barely put the grief into words. Losing John was like losing a brother. He was someone he had loved, hated, fought with, and admired all at once. And for the rest of his life, Paul carried that mixture of regret and affection. John Lennon was the first and perhaps the deepest wound on Paul McCartney's personal blacklist.
And then it was blown up. I mean, I just spoke the truth. and it's sometimes painful.
Michael Jackson, the costliest betrayal. If John Lennon represented the pain of a broken brotherhood, Michael Jackson brought something even more bitter: betrayal. In the early 1980s, Paul and Michael were unlikely but close friends. They recorded songs together like Say, Say, Say and The Girl Is Mine. Off stage, they spent hours talking about life and music. Paul treated Michael almost like a younger brother, someone he could guide through the ups and downs of fame. One day, in those friendly conversations, Paul shared a piece of advice. He explained how owning the music rights, publishing rights, was the smartest investment a musician could make. Paul himself had bought the catalogs of other artists and was earning a steady income from them.
I think the four of us would probably just prefer to leave it as it was.
It was meant as a friendly tip from one artist to another. However, in 1985, that advice came back to haunt him. The company ATV Music, which owned most of the Beatles' songs, suddenly went up for sale. Paul dreamed of buying the catalog himself, reclaiming the music he and John had written. Surprisingly, before he could act, Michael Jackson swooped in. With a bid of $47.5 million, Michael purchased the Beatles catalog outright. To Paul, it felt like a knife in the back. The very advice he had given a friend had been turned against him. Overnight, the songs Paul had poured his heart into now belonged to someone else, someone he had trusted. At first, Paul tried to laugh it off, even calling it business. But as time went on, the bitterness grew. He wrote letters to Michael, asking if they could renegotiate, if he might return some of the rights. Michael refused. Later, when Michael sold half the catalog to Sony, Paul felt the betrayal all over again. What stung the most wasn't just losing control of his music, it was losing a friendship. "I thought we were friends," Paul later said, but then Michael turned it into a business deal. Their bond never recovered. George Harrison, the guitarist who walked out. If John Lennon was Paul's equal and rival, George Harrison was the quiet shadow often left in the background. He joined the Beatles as a teenager, just 16, and became their lead guitarist. His gentle nature and spiritual curiosity balanced the band in many ways, but his relationship with Paul was often rocky. Paul, ever the perfectionist, had a habit of telling George exactly how to play. Sometimes he would even pick up the guitar to show him. In Paul's mind, it was about serving the song, but to George, it felt like suffocation. Time and again, his carefully crafted guitar parts were dismissed or reworked. By the time of the Let It Be sessions in early 1969, the tension was unbearable. Cameras captured Paul lecturing George on how to play a part, his tone clipped and sharp. George finally snapped. In the middle of a session, he put down his guitar and said quietly, "I'll see you around the clubs." Then he walked out. The others were stunned. For days, the Beatles carried on without him. It took pleading and the promise of changes for George to return. But the damage had been done. To him, Paul wasn't just a bandmate anymore. He was a source of constant frustration. George later voiced his feelings openly. "Working with Paul," he said, "is like having your hands tied. He always thinks he knows everything." That bitterness lingered long after the Beatles split. Even in the 1970s, when they reunited for the occasional jam, George kept his distance. Paul, for his part, always insisted he only pushed George because he respected his talent. But respect can sometimes feel like control, and for George, it was too much. Though their friendship mellowed in later years, the old tension never fully disappeared. When George died in 2001, Paul mourned him deeply. But hidden beneath the grief was a memory of years spent clashing, one more scar from the band that had changed the world. Allen Klein and the lawsuit that tore the Beatles apart. The Beatles' troubles didn't begin with music, they began with money. In 1967, the band's trusted manager, Brian Epstein, died suddenly of an accidental drug overdose. Brian had been their anchor, the man who handled the contracts, the tours, the business side of things, so that the four could focus on the music. Without him, they were simply lost. Apple Corps, the company the Beatles set up, soon became a circus. They poured money into films, boutiques, and wild experiments, but no one really knew how to run it. Millions vanished, and the band's empire was on the verge of collapse. Into this chaos stepped Allen Klein, a sharp-talking manager who had worked with the Rolling Stones. John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were impressed by his confidence. He promised them more money, tighter control, and protection from greedy record labels. Desperate for stability, the three of them signed with Klein, but Paul McCartney didn't trust him. He thought Klein was too slick, too quick with promises. Paul wanted the band to be managed by Eastman & Eastman, the law firm run by his wife Linda's family, but the others refused. Suddenly, Paul was outnumbered. The tension boiled over, and Paul was cut out of major decisions. Allen began reshaping Apple Corp without him. For Paul, it wasn't just about money, but trust. He felt betrayed by his bandmates, the same men he had once called brothers. On December 31, 1970, Paul made a decision that shocked the world. He filed a lawsuit not just against Allen Klein, but against John, George, and Ringo. He wanted to dissolve the Beatles' partnership entirely. Overnight, Paul was painted as the villain, the man who had killed the Beatles. But time proved him right. A few years later, Allen was caught skimming profits and pocketing more than he was owed. He was sued and ordered to repay the Beatles hundreds of thousands of pounds. By then, though, the band was long gone. The lawsuit had driven a wedge so deep it could never be repaired. For Paul McCartney, Allen Klein's name was etched onto his personal blacklist, not just as a crooked businessman, but as the man who turned his bandmates against him. Yoko Ono and the divide she represented. Few names stir up as much debate in Beatles history as Yoko Ono, and for Paul McCartney, she was more than just John Lennon's partner. She was the wedge that symbolized the band's unraveling. From the moment John brought Yoko into the studio in the late 1960s, Paul felt the balance shift. The Beatles had always worked as a closed circle, just four men in tune with each other, reading unspoken cues, finishing each other's songs. Suddenly, there was a new presence in the room. Yoko didn't just sit quietly in the background. She gave opinions, challenged ideas, and sometimes even took part in recording sessions. For Paul, it broke an unspoken rule. Wives and girlfriends didn't interfere with the Beatles' business. Yoko's constant presence made Paul feel pushed aside, as though John no longer valued the partnership that had defined their lives. The tension spilled into the music. During the Get Back sessions, Paul was visibly frustrated, trying to hold the band together while John seemed increasingly distracted by his relationship with Yoko. Paul later admitted that he sometimes resented her, not out of jealousy, but because he felt she had changed John. Yet, even in the middle of that resentment, Paul tried to be fair. Decades later, he admitted that John was so deeply in love that it would have been impossible for him to resist Yoko's influence. He even acknowledged that she pushed John to explore new creative directions. In interviews long after Lennon's death, Paul softened his stance, praising Yoko as an important part of John's life and legacy, but she would not be the last of the people who rocked Paul's world badly. Frank Sinatra and the War of Words. On the surface, Paul McCartney and Frank Sinatra should have admired each other. Both were masters of melody, both had voices that defined generations, and both carried themselves like icons. But instead of respect, what grew between them was a cold rivalry. The trouble started when Sinatra openly mocked one of Paul's most personal songs, Yesterday. To most of the world, it was a masterpiece, but Sinatra dismissed it as lousy. Coming from the chairman of the board, that stung, and it didn't stop there. Sinatra was also dismissive of Something, George Harrison's ballad that Paul had always championed as one of the Beatles' finest love songs. Sinatra would sometimes perform it in concert, but would introduce it as the greatest Lennon-McCartney song ever written, erasing George's name and reducing the Beatles' legacy to a joke. For Paul, it was disrespectful on multiple levels. Not only was Sinatra tearing down his own work, he was also slighting George. The feud was never a screaming match or a brawl. It was quieter, built from cutting remarks and bruised egos. But for Paul, who poured his heart into songs like Yesterday, Sinatra's words cut deep. To him, it wasn't just criticism, it was contempt. And while Sinatra's star power meant he didn't need Paul's approval, Paul never forgot the sting. It became yet another name on his personal blacklist. Heather Mills, the bitter divorce. Not all of Paul McCartney's feuds came from the music world. Some were deeply personal, and none left as bitter a mark as his marriage to Heather Mills. Paul met Heather in 2000, a year after the death of his first wife, Linda. At first, it seemed like a second chance at love. Heather, a former model and activist, swept Paul into a whirlwind romance. By 2002, they were married. For a while, things looked happy. They welcomed a daughter, Beatrice, in 2003. But behind the smiles, cracks were forming. Their personalities clashed, and their arguments often spilled into the press. When they finally split in 2006, the divorce quickly became one of the most acrimonious in British celebrity history. Heather accused Paul of abusive behavior. Paul denied it, maintaining that the claims were exaggerated or outright false. The tabloids feasted on every detail, painting Heather as manipulative and Paul as stubborn. What might have been a quiet separation turned into a public spectacle. In 2008, the divorce settlement was finalized. Heather was awarded just over £24 million, a fraction of what she had originally demanded. The judge's ruling was scathing, dismissing many of her claims as inconsistent and unreliable. For Paul, it was vindication, but also humiliation. His private life had been ripped apart in front of the world. Even years later, the bitterness never fully faded. Heather often spoke out against Paul in interviews, painting him as cold and controlling. Paul, for his part, rarely mentioned her, preferring silence over reopening old wounds. Among all the names on his feud list, Heather Mills stands out as the one who turned Paul's personal life upside down. Unlike the battles with Lennon or Jackson, this wasn't about art, business, or music. It was about trust, betrayal, and the scars of a marriage gone wrong. Paul McCartney has spent more than 6 decades as one of the world's greatest songwriters, yet even a figure as beloved as he is has carried his share of grudges. Yet through it all, Paul endured. His music never stopped, and his creativity never dimmed. The names on his blacklist reminds us that he was human, capable of hurt, pride, and anger. Also, they reveal the resilience that allowed him to outlast nearly everyone he sparred with. Do you think Paul McCartney's hatred was justified? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. And don't forget to click the next video showing on your screen. You won't want to miss it.